So let's talk about SQL as it relates to Rock. And with great power comes great responsibility. So from the very beginning here, what I want to say is I don't want to discourage your use of SQL, but I just want you to make sure you understand the responsibility that comes when you use SQL with Rock. And you don't want this to be your first tool. If you know SQL, it's possible that you might jump to SQL before you should, but it should always be the second or third choice when you're looking at things with Rock. And I want to show you some warnings, and then I want to show you some tips of how you can actually use it more effectively. So if you think about Rock as a castle, there's two places you can live in the medieval times. You can live within the castle walls if you're lucky, or a lot of people have to live outside the castle wall. And what I would classify SQL is that's definitely living outside the castle wall. That's not necessarily to say you shouldn't do it, you should never do it. Sometimes that's just what you have to do. Sometimes SQL is the right answer. But since it's outside the castle wall, you don't want that to be your first answer. And so the obvious question, well, why do you say it's outside the castle wall? Well, there's just a lot of protection that's not there when you use SQL. And so let's look at two issues of risk that you incur when you use SQL. The first is if you have a database model, say person, and we have some fields on that, first name, last name, and then we have these two fields. Maybe we start with my sample field shipped with version 1, and then later as the core team, we don't like to do this, but sometimes we have to do this. We change it to my new sample field. Maybe there's a conversion of the data type or the length or something that we just needed to do. Inside the castle wall, we can do some magical tricks. We can deprecate that column, or that field, which basically means we'll give you a warning, and when you compile next time, we're going to warn you that that field is not that field anymore and you shouldn't use it, and then eventually we'll just get rid of it. But we're going to give you warnings, and we're going to map the old field to actually read from the new field. So if you still use it in C# or Lava, you're still going to get the right answer. But we have all these tricks that we can use when we're inside the castle wall, but when you're doing SQL, there's no way for us to inform you on that. And so often what might happen is your SQL will break when we finally drop the old field. So that's something you really need to be careful about. Like, we try not to change the data model in this way, but it's impossible for us to keep innovating and not doing this in certain cases. Another example, and this was probably even a more important example, is insert updates and deletes are very dangerous to do inside of SQL. Selects have the problem that we just discussed, fields move, and it could break your SQL. But you definitely don't want to do insert updates and deletes in SQL. Why? Because there's no validation. So you could put bad data in there, whereas in C# we're doing validation on all that data. We're making sure that the data that's in the database is consistent and correct. And if you're doing that in SQL, there's no way for us to validate that. There's a teeny bit of validation that can be done in the database, but nothing like the rich validation that's happening in the service layer of Rock. And so you're passing that validation. And I see that quite a bit, working with churches in the community. They'll report an issue, or I'll be talking with them. And a lot of times what they've done is they've changed that data behind the scenes, and then they have an issue inside of Rock, and it's because they're trying to go around the castle wall, and it's very well fortified. And it's sometimes if you push against it, it's going to push you back in terms of what might look like an error or an issue, but it's actually the fact that you've tried to scale the castle wall and fell off. Also, it bypasses the business logic. So you might have put the right data in the right place, but the business logic in Rock might have updated 3 or 4 other things based on what you did, and you didn't know to do that. So now you have inconsistent data, and that's not good. That's always going to cause problems later. And so when we look at this bypassing business logic, that happens when you use insert updates and deletes in SQL. And it can also happen too on an import or migration. If you don't do it right, you've brought in that data through means that bypass the business logic and you didn't get everything just right. So sometimes it's common when people move to Rock and have not done a correct migration, they can have these same types of issues. And then another one, this is another big one, is it doesn't update cache. So there are very hard things in computer science, and one of those things is cache invalidation. So when we update, like say the name of a group type, you know, inside the castle wall, we know to go to update the cache, and so everything's fine. But when you go around the castle wall, or you're working outside the castle wall, the cache can't be updated. So you might have changed it in SQL, but you're not going to see it reflected in Rock until either Rock is started, or you flush the cache, or the cache times out. These are things you just don't want to have happen, and it can cause a lot of grief for you. So just realize when you change things in SQL, it doesn't update the cache. Now that said, those are the warnings. There are a lot of cool things you can do with SQL though. You know, one of the things is the dynamic data block. I'm sure a lot of you are using that, and that's highly appropriate. That's good. We use it quite a bit within Triumph. It's not our go-to though. You know, we always try to use data views and reports when we can, but just like every tool in the toolbox is not the same tool. We have different tools for different purposes. The dynamic data block is another tool that we will go to when those tools are not as effective. And these blocks allow nice filtering through some parameter filtering blocks that can update the query string, which updates this block. The dynamic data block is a great block and very powerful. And so a great way to use SQL when you understand that this is still outside the castle wall a bit. Now, when we look at other tools that we can do to craft our SQL, there's two tools I want to talk about. But before I get to them, I want to talk about some code editors. So if you're familiar with these two tools, Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, you know, Visual Studio is a robust, powerful code editor for writing C# and doing really big, amazing things. Visual Studio Code is kind of like the newer, younger brother. It's very fast, it's very effective, it's a great tool, but it's not as feature rich as Visual Studio. But a lot of times we would prefer to use Visual Studio Code because it's just faster and cleaner and quicker. When you go to look at SQL and to author your SQL, there's also two tools in the same paradigm. There's SQL Server Management Studio, which is what most people use, SSMS. It's been around forever. Doesn't really get a ton of new features, a couple, not a ton though, but it's what most people have been using. There is a new tool called Azure Data Studio. Now, it's a great tool, maybe not the best name because it's not really limited to Azure. You can connect this to straight SQL Server. You can connect it to other databases that aren't even SQL Server. You know, I think they're really trying to tie it to that Azure brand name, but don't let Azure the Azure Data Studio fool you. You can use it with lots of different environments. And if you look underneath the code, it's actually written on the same foundation that Visual Studio Code is. So Microsoft has been using that same kind of project structure and technology beyond Visual Studio Code, and Azure Data Studio is one of them. And so I just want to show you this new tool and just show you that it's a great tool, and I would highly recommend using it. I've moved away from SSMS in like 95% of the stuff I do. I'm trying to do everything in Azure Data Studio. It's a couple small teeny things I can't do there, but they keep adding to it like all the time. So it won't be long before everything is in Azure Data Studio. So let's take a look at it. This is the tool. You have modes. You can do dark mode. You can do light mode. It's up to you. This is dark mode, of course. And I just want to point out a few things that I like about this. First off, if I look over here in the Connections tab, there's different ways to connect. So where I'm pointing at here is it's pointing at a local instance. Okay, and so that gives me the same thing I'm used to in SSMS. It'll show, if I open that up, it'll show me all the databases in that local instance, exactly like SSMS. But you can also choose to connect to a specific database on your instance. It's a small thing, but sometimes that's so helpful. It just keeps you from having to drill down a tree that you just don't need. Maybe you're working on a production server, it only has one database. Connect straight to the database. You don't have to click 3 times to get to the tables. And when we do that, when we open it, we go straight to the tables. So really nice. It's up to you how you organize that. And if we actually just go back here, you can see that, I organize mine a little differently. So I have these like groupings, which is kind of nice. SSMS doesn't have that. You can highlight the color of your groupings. Just allows you to organize that much, much better, which is very cool. Okay, so let's jump ahead. This is the overall experience that you get. It's very similar to SSMS. You can see where the code editor, where the SQL editor is, and you can see the results down below it, and that's pretty cool. Very similar, same messaging that you get with SSMS. If I go down the tabs over there on the left, you can see that there's plugins too. So there's a ton of neat plugins that you can go in there. I would say too, like if you find that you can't do something in SSMS, go over to the plugins and search for it. Because even Microsoft has put a lot of their own tools into the plugins. And so what you might have been used to doing in the SSMS may not be in the core version of Azure Data Studio, but there's a plugin that does it for you. So, and people write their own plugins, and it's actually pretty cool. And the next tab is the workspace tab. And so this is where you can open up a local workspace, like a local file system, and you can have your little files here, and you can use your SQL that's on your file system. So it's good to have a SQL library of your commonly used stuff, so you get to reuse it, to keep writing it over and over and over. And so this workspace is really a cool space to do that. And that's right there in the navigation. Now there's also this thing built in. Git is built right in to your Azure Data Studio, and this allows you to do source control on those workspaces that I just mentioned, which is way cool. Like you want this stuff in source control so you can control the versioning and maybe share it with a team. And so that's right there. And it's even pretty powerful. It tells you if you have changes that haven't been staged and committed and pushed, it'll remind you that. So in this case, you can see here that I do have one change to the 10 largest tables in Rock. And it's telling me, hey, you might want to, it's modified, you might want to stage and commit that, and you can push it out. So that's really, really cool. What's really exciting here is that we have, Spark has a SQL library that we're putting out for everybody to use. And so if you just go out there, it's at GitHub Spark Dev Network /rock-SQL-library. You can go out there and you can use the SQL library. It's broken down into folders by the different domains that make up Rock. Not every domain has SQL scripts in it. We just made the folder so that we knew where they should go when we add them. But there is a lot of great SQL out there that you can just use and you don't even have to write. So go out here to the library, go ahead and take a look at it, and I think you'll find it very helpful. Let me show you how to do this within Azure Data Studio. Okay, so the first thing, I'm assuming you don't have this already cloned to your local machine. That's what we're going to do. You're going to go up into the little command prompt. You can either find it by clicking, or you can hit Control-Shift-P, and you're going to search for git clone. Okay, and that's showing you the git clone. Then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to that address I showed you, and you're gonna go to the clone dropdown, choose clone with HTTPS. You're gonna click that little button, which is going to copy the clone address into your clipboard, and you're gonna paste it in that prompt. That's then gonna say, hey, where do you want to put this clone on your local drive? So you just pick a local folder here, just asking you which one you want. Then it's gonna say, once you pick it, do you want to open the clone repository and add it to the current workspace? Well, yes, please. I mean, that's going to save you a couple steps right there. And then once you do that, you're going to have this nice little drop down on these little ellipses dots. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pull that. Now your clone will bring it down for you, but there's going to be changes that we're going to be pushing out there. So you're going to want to constantly be pulling to get those recent changes. And so that's how you're going to keep your local system up to date. At this point, the repository is read-only, so you can't push and new things into it. We're trying to keep it really clean with high-quality SQL. Over time, we'll probably open it up to people, maybe to do pull requests into, and then eventually, when we get a smaller group of people that we can trust that they're using the right formatting and they're putting high-quality SQL in there, then we'll open it up wider to them. One reason why for the concern here is that it is possible if you write bad SQL, you can damage a person's database. You could delete everything, you could alter tables, and that's what we don't want. We want to make sure that whatever's in there is for the most part safe. That said, it is SQL, so you do need to be careful. This isn't for someone who doesn't understand what SQL is, but what we have in there has been used by a lot of us for quite a while. So again, just want to go over this again, that SQL is outside the castle wall. I wouldn't make it my first tool. And again, if you know SQL and you like SQL, it often our most known tool is our most used tool, and you want to resist that. You want to make sure that you're always using the right tool for the job. And so you just want to continue to think through and consider if SQL is the right tool for that. But in no way am I saying you should never use it. It's just making sure that you consider, is it the right tool for the job?